I thought I would die in that hospital. The American soldier standing in the doorway thought so too. His rifle hung loose at his side, pointed at the floor, but his eyes swept the room like he expected ghosts. I pressed myself harder against the wall behind the overturned cabinet, my breath shallow, my hands shaking so badly I had to clasp them together to stop the noise. The smell of iodine and old blood filled my nose. Outside, the rumble of tanks echoed through the shattered streets of Berlin, a sound that had become as constant as my own heartbeat. The war was over. Germany had lost, and I was alone in the ruins of a place that used to save lives. I had been hiding here for 3 days, maybe 4. Time had become elastic, unreliable. The hospital had been abandoned when the Soviet artillery started falling closer, when the doctors and nurses fled west or simply vanished into the chaos. I stayed because I had nowhere else to go. My apartment building was rubble. My neighbors were dead or gone. My husband had died 2 years ago on the Eastern Front, and I had spent the time since then working here as a volunteer, cleaning wounds, holding hands, pretending I could make a difference. Now the building was a hollow shell, windows blown out, walls pocked with bullet holes. The second floor collapsed into the first in places. But it still had a roof over some of the rooms, and it still had corners where a woman could hide from the men who came looking. The soldier took a step inside. His boots crunched on broken glass. He called out something in English, his voice careful, not aggressive. I did not understand the words, but I understood the tone. He was clearing the building, looking for threats, looking for survivors, looking for people like me. I tried to make myself smaller, invisible. My dress was filthy, torn at the hem, stained with things I did not want to remember. My hair hung in lank strands around my face. I had not eaten in 2 days. My stomach was a knot of emptiness and fear, and my mouth tasted like metal. If he found me, what would he do? I had heard the stories. Women pulled from basements, women dragged into the streets. The Soviets were worse, everyone said, but the Americans were still soldiers, still men, still part of the army that had burned our cities to ash. He moved deeper into the room, his silhouette framed by the gray afternoon light filtering through the broken windows. He was tall, broad-shouldered, younger than I expected, maybe 25. His uniform was dusty but intact, his helmet slightly crooked on his head. He carried himself with a strange combination of alertness and exhaustion, like someone who had been awake for days but could not afford to stop. He scanned the debris, the toppled gurneys, the scattered medical supplies, the dark stains on the floor that used to be blood but had turned black and dry. Then he saw me. I froze. Our eyes met across the wreckage, and for a moment, neither of us moved. His hand shifted on the rifle, not raising it, but adjusting his grip, ready. My heart hammered so hard I thought it would break through my ribs. I waited for him to shout, to call for others, to point the gun at my chest. But he did not. He just stared at me, his expression unreadable, and then he said something in English again, softer this time, almost gentle. I shook my head. I did not speak English. I only spoke German, and that made me the enemy. He lowered the rifle completely, letting it hang from the strap across his chest. Then he raised both hands, palms out, in a gesture I understood. He was showing me he meant no harm. Slowly, carefully, he took another step forward. I flinched, pulling my knees tighter to my chest, but I did not run. There was nowhere to run. He crouched down a few feet away from me, still keeping his distance, and studied my face. His eyes were blue, startlingly blue, the kind of blue that reminded me of summer skies from a lifetime ago. He looked at me like I was a person, not a threat, not a symbol of defeat. He looked at me like he saw someone worth worrying about. He reached into his jacket and pulled out something wrapped in brown paper, a ration bar. He held it out to me, nodding encouragingly, and said another English word I did not know. But I understood the offer. Food. I hesitated. My pride told me to refuse. My body told me to take it. Hunger won. I reached out slowly, my hand trembling, and took the bar from him. Our fingers did not touch, but I felt the warmth of his presence, the strange safety of it. I tore open the paper and bit into the bar. It was dry and tasteless and the most wonderful thing I had ever eaten. He watched me eat, and something in his expression softened. Then he spoke again, slower this time, and pointed to himself. Michael. His name was Michael. I swallowed the mouthful of food and whispered my own name, Annalisa. He repeated it, his accent clumsy but earnest, and he smiled. It was a small smile, tired but real. And in that moment, in that shattered hospital, in a city that had been bombed into silence, I felt something I had not felt in years. I felt seen. Michael stood and gestured for me to follow him. I did not know where he wanted to take me, but I knew I could not stay here. The Soviets controlled the eastern part of the city, and their patrols were getting closer every day. The Americans were pulling back to their designated zones. If I stayed, I would be trapped between armies, or worse, found by men who would not offer me ration bars and gentle smiles. I got to my feet, my legs stiff and aching, and followed him out of the room. He led me through the ruined corridors of the hospital, past operating rooms with doors hanging off their hinges, past wards where the beds still held the shapes of bodies long gone. He moved with purpose, checking corners, listening for sounds, keeping me close, but not touching me. He treated me like something fragile, something that might break if handled wrong. Outside, the city was a landscape of ghosts. Buildings leaned at impossible angles, their facades stripped away to reveal the hollow rooms inside. Smoke still rose from distant fires. The streets were empty except for the occasional patrol or the scurrying figure of someone trying to stay invisible. The sky was the color of ash. Michael led me to a jeep parked 2 blocks away, half hidden behind a pile of rubble. Another soldier sat in the driver's seat, younger, nervous-looking. He glanced at me and said something sharp in English. Michael replied in the same language, his tone firm but not angry. The other soldier frowned but did not argue. Michael opened the back of the jeep and gestured for me to get in. I climbed into the seat, my body aching with every movement, and he draped a canvas tarp over me, hiding me from view. Then he climbed into the front, and the jeep lurched forward, rattling over broken pavement and debris. Under the tarp, I closed my eyes and tried to breathe. I did not know where he was taking me. I did not know if I could trust him. But I knew that for the first time in days, I was not alone. And that had to be enough. The jeep stopped after what felt like an hour, but was probably only 20 minutes. I heard voices, American voices, casual and relaxed. The sound of engines idling, the clatter of equipment. We were at some kind of base or checkpoint. Michael pulled back the tarp just enough to look at me, and he put a finger to his lips. "Stay quiet." I nodded. I stayed hidden while he climbed out and spoke to someone, his voice easy and confident. I heard laughter. I heard the clink of metal. Then he returned, and the jeep started moving again. This time we drove for longer, through streets that were less destroyed, past buildings that still had walls and roofs. Eventually, we stopped in front of a small house on the edge of the city, a place that looked almost untouched by the war. Michael got out and came around to help me down from the jeep. The other soldier drove away without a word. Michael led me to the front door and knocked. A moment later, it opened, and an older woman stood there, German by the look of her, her face lined and weary but kind. Michael spoke to her in broken German. A few words I could barely understand, but the woman nodded and stepped aside to let us in. Inside, the house was warm. There was a fire in the stove, a table with chairs, a smell of something cooking. The woman gestured for me to sit, and I did, my legs finally giving out beneath me. Michael spoke to her quietly, and she disappeared into another room, returning with a blanket and a cup of water. I drank the water in desperate gulps, and the woman smiled at me with sad, knowing eyes. She said something in German, and I understood this time. "You are safe here." Michael crouched beside my chair and looked at me with those impossibly blue eyes. He said something in English, and though I did not understand the words, I understood the meaning. He had brought me here to protect me. He had risked something to pull me out of that hospital and bring me to this place. I did not know why. I did not know what he wanted from me. But as I sat there, wrapped in a stranger's blanket, warm for the first time in days, I felt something shift inside me, a crack in the wall I had built around my heart, and I realized I was crying. Michael reached out, hesitated, then gently touched my hand. Just for a second, just long enough to remind me I was still human. I looked at him through my tears and tried to find the words, any words, to thank him. But all I could manage was his name, whispered like a prayer. Michael. He smiled again, that same tired, real smile, and nodded. Then he stood and spoke to the woman, and together they left me alone by the fire, wrapped in warmth and the strange, fragile beginning of hope. I stayed in that house for 5 days before I learned the woman's name was Marguerite. She was a widow, too, her husband killed in France in 1940, her 2 sons lost somewhere on the Eastern Front. She had survived the fall of Berlin by keeping her head down, by being useful to whoever needed her, by speaking softly and asking no questions. When Michael brought me to her door, she had understood immediately what he was asking, and she had agreed without hesitation. Perhaps she saw in me the daughter she never had, or perhaps she simply could not turn away someone in need. Either way, she fed me, gave me clean clothes, and let me sleep in the small room upstairs that used to belong to one of her sons. Michael came every other day, always in the late afternoon when the light was fading and the patrols were changing shifts. He brought food, medicine, sometimes just cigarettes for Marguerite. He never stayed long, maybe 20 minutes, maybe half an hour. But in those short visits, something began to build between us, a language made of gestures and broken words, of shared looks and careful smiles. He would sit at the table while Marguerite made tea, and I would sit across from him, and we would try to talk. He taught me English words. Hello, thank you, safe, friend. I taught him German words in return, though he struggled with the sounds, his tongue tripping over the consonants. We laughed sometimes, quietly, at his mistakes. It felt strange to laugh. It felt like betraying the dead. But Michael made it seem possible. He had a lightness about him, a way of moving through the world that suggested he believed things could get better. I did not know where that optimism came from, not in a man who had seen combat, who had watched his friends die, who was living in the ruins of a country that hated him. But it was there, steady and unshakable, and it made me want to believe too. On the 6th day, he came earlier than usual, his face tight with worry. He spoke quickly to Marguerite, and she nodded, her expression grave. Then he turned to me and said my name, motioning for me to follow him upstairs. My heart lurched. Something was wrong. In the small bedroom, he closed the door and stood close, too close, his voice low and urgent. He spoke in English, and I caught only fragments: patrol, inspection, tomorrow. He pointed at the floor, at the walls, and then at me. Hide, I understood. The Americans were going to search the neighborhood, looking for German soldiers in hiding, for weapons caches, for anything that might be a threat. And if they found me here, sheltered by one of their own, it would mean trouble for Michael, possibly arrest, possibly worse. I was a liability, a risk he could not afford. I nodded to show I understood, and he relaxed slightly. Then he did something I did not expect. He reached out and took my hand, holding it between both of his. His palms were warm and rough, calloused from work and weapons. He looked at me with those blue eyes, and he said something in English, slow and deliberate, like he wanted to make sure I understood the feeling, even if I did not understand the words. I felt my throat tighten. I nodded again, squeezing his hand, and he let go. That night, Marguerite and I prepared. There was a root cellar beneath the kitchen, accessible through a trapdoor hidden under a rug. It was small and damp and smelled of earth and old potatoes, but it was deep enough that voices from above would be muffled. Margaret showed me how to lift the door from the inside, how to stay quiet, how to wait. She gave me a blanket and a candle and a box of matches, and she told me not to light the candle unless I absolutely had to. Light could be seen through cracks. The next morning, I went down into the cellar before dawn. Margaret replaced the rug and went about her day as if nothing were different. I sat in the darkness, wrapped in the blanket, listening to the muffled sounds of the world above. Footsteps, voices, doors opening and closing, the creak of floorboards. My heart beat so loudly I was sure it would give me away. Hours passed. I lost track of time. My legs cramped. My back ached. I thought about Michael, about the risk he was taking for me, about what would happen to him if they found me. I thought about my husband, about the last letter I had received from him before he died, about how he had written that he loved me and that he was sorry. Sorry for leaving me, sorry for the war, sorry for everything. I had not been able to give him children. We had tried for 3 years, and nothing had happened. The doctors said it was me, something wrong inside me, something broken. My husband had said it did not matter, that he loved me anyway. But I saw the disappointment in his eyes, the way he stopped talking about the future. And then he went to war and never came back, and I was left alone with the knowledge that I had failed him in the one thing that mattered. I pressed my hands against my stomach, against the emptiness there, and I felt the familiar ache of shame. Above me, the voices grew louder. I heard boots on the floor. American voices, sharp and efficient. They were searching the house. I held my breath and pressed myself into the corner of the cellar, making myself as small as possible. The trap door was directly above me, hidden beneath the rug. If they moved the rug, if they found the door, it was over. The footsteps moved through the kitchen. I heard the scrape of furniture being moved, the clatter of dishes. Margaret's voice, calm and cooperative, answering questions in broken English. Then silence, long, terrible silence. And then the footsteps moved away. The voices faded. The front door closed. I waited. I counted to 100, then 200. I did not move until I heard Margaret knock 3 times on the floor above me, the signal we had agreed on. It was safe. I pushed open the trap door and climbed out, my legs shaking, my body stiff. Margaret was standing in the kitchen, her face pale but composed. She nodded at me and said one word: "Gone." I sank into a chair and put my head in my hands. I had been so afraid, so sure they would find me. But Michael had protected me. He had made sure the search was routine, unremarkable. He had kept me safe. That evening, he came to the house, and the relief on his face when he saw me was so raw it almost hurt to witness. He crossed the room in 3 strides and stopped in front of me, his hands hovering like he wanted to touch me but did not dare. I stood, and before I could think about it, before I could stop myself, I reached out and put my arms around him. He went still for a moment, surprised. Then his arms came around me, careful and tentative, and he held me like I was something precious. I pressed my face against his chest and felt the steady beat of his heart, and for the first time since the war began, I felt safe. Not just physically safe, but safe in a way that went deeper, that reached the parts of me I had kept locked away. We stood like that for a long time, neither of us speaking. Margaret had left the room, giving us privacy. Outside, the city was settling into evening, the last light fading from the sky. And in that small kitchen, in that house on the edge of Berlin, something shifted between us. Something irreversible. When we finally pulled apart, Michael cupped my face in his hands and looked at me with an intensity that made my breath catch. He said something in English, his voice rough with emotion, and though I did not understand every word, I understood the meaning. He cared about me. He wanted to protect me. He was willing to risk everything for me, and I realized, with a jolt of fear and wonder, that I felt the same. Over the following weeks, Michael's visits became more frequent. He found reasons to come by, to check on us, to bring supplies. He taught me more English, and I taught him more German, and slowly, painfully, we learned to communicate. We talked about small things at first. His home in Pennsylvania, the farm where he grew up, the kid brother he missed. My life before the war, the hospital, the apartment I used to have, the dreams I used to carry. We did not talk about the war itself. That was too raw, too close. We did not talk about the future, because neither of us believed we had one. We only talked about the present, about the moments we could steal together, about the strange and fragile thing growing between us. Margaret watched us with knowing eyes, but she said nothing. She only made sure we had privacy when we needed it, and she covered for us when Michael stayed too long, when his absences from base became harder to explain. One evening, as we sat together in the small parlor, Michael reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. He handed it to me, his expression nervous. I unfolded it and saw a drawing, rough and simple, of two figures standing together under a tree. One was tall, wearing a uniform. The other was smaller, in a dress. Underneath, in careful letters, he had written our names, Michael and Annalisa. I looked up at him, my eyes burning with tears, and he smiled that tired, real smile. He said something in English, and this time I understood enough to catch the meaning. This is us. This is what I want. I folded the paper carefully and held it against my chest. I wanted to tell him yes, that I wanted it too, that I had not felt this way about anyone since my husband died. But I also wanted to tell him the truth, the thing I had been carrying like a stone in my chest, the thing that made me unworthy of the hope in his eyes. But I could not find the words, not yet. So I just reached for his hand and held it tight, and I let myself believe, for one more evening, that this could be real. Outside, the world was still broken. The city was still in ruins. The war was still a fresh wound. But in that room, with Michael's hand in mine, I felt something I had thought was lost forever. I felt the possibility of love. Summer came to Berlin like a hesitant guest, bringing warmth to the rubble and coaxing weeds up through the cracks in the pavement. The city was still a graveyard, but life was beginning to stir in small, stubborn ways. People emerged from their hiding places. Markets opened in the cleared streets, selling whatever scraps could be salvaged or bartered. Children played in the ruins, their laughter strange and almost obscene against the backdrop of so much destruction. And Michael and I found ways to be together. He arranged for me to work in the American mess hall, washing dishes and preparing vegetables under the supervision of a German cook who asked no questions. It gave me a reason to be near the base, a cover story that kept me safe from suspicion. And it gave Michael an excuse to see me every day, even if only in passing, even if only for a few stolen minutes in the storage room or behind the kitchen tent. We were careful. We had to be. Fraternization between American soldiers and German women was officially discouraged, and for Michael to be involved with someone like me, someone who had no papers, no official status, was dangerous for both of us. If anyone discovered the truth, he could be reassigned, dishonorably discharged, or worse. And I could be deported, sent east into Soviet territory, where women like me simply disappeared. But we could not stay away from each other. The pull between us was too strong, too undeniable. It was not just attraction, though I felt that too, a physical ache whenever he was near. It was something deeper, a recognition, a sense that we were both survivors of something terrible and that we understood each other in ways no one else could. One evening in July, Michael smuggled me out of the city in the back of a supply truck. We drove for an hour, past checkpoints and patrols, until we reached a small lake surrounded by pine trees. It was a place the Americans used for recreation, a pocket of peace far from the destroyed streets. The water was calm and clear, reflecting the sky like a mirror. Michael helped me down from the truck and led me to the shore. The air smelled of pine and water, clean and fresh, so different from the stench of smoke and decay that hung over Berlin. We sat on a fallen log, our shoulders touching, and watched the sun sink toward the horizon. For a long time, neither of us spoke. We just sat together, breathing in the quiet, letting the stillness settle over us like a blanket. Then Michael turned to me and said my name, his voice soft and uncertain. I looked at him, and I saw the question in his eyes. The question he had been carrying for weeks, maybe longer. He wanted to know if I felt the same way he did. He wanted to know if this was real. I reached for his hand and laced my fingers through his. Yes, I wanted to say. Yes, this is real. But the words caught in my throat, tangled up with the secret I had been holding, the truth I had not told him. Michael leaned closer, his face inches from mine, and I felt the warmth of his breath. He said something in English, his voice low and earnest, and I understood enough to know he was telling me he cared about me, that he wanted to be with me, that nothing else mattered. And then he kissed me. It was gentle at first, tentative, like he was afraid I might pull away. But I did not pull away. I leaned into him, my hands coming up to his face, and I kissed him back with all the longing and fear and hope I had been carrying. His arms came around me, pulling me close, and I felt the solid strength of him, the way he held me like I was something worth protecting. We broke apart, both of us breathing hard, and he rested his forehead against mine. He said my name again, and this time it sounded like a promise. I wanted to believe in that promise. I wanted to let myself fall into this, to trust that we could have something beyond the war, beyond the ruins. But the weight of my secret pressed down on me, heavy and suffocating, and I knew I could not let this go any further without telling him the truth. I pulled back slightly and looked into his eyes. I spoke in halting English, the words awkward and clumsy, but I forced them out. I cannot have children, I said. My body is broken. I cannot give you a family. Michael frowned, confused at first, trying to understand. I repeated it in German, slower, and I saw the moment comprehension dawned on his face. He shook his head, his expression softening, and he cupped my face in his hands. He spoke in English, clear and firm, and though my grasp of the language was still fragile, I understood the most important part. I do not care. I do not care if you are German. I do not care if you cannot have children. I care about you, just you. Tears spilled down my cheeks, hot and sudden. I had been so afraid of this moment, so sure that telling him would be the end, that he would pull away, that he would realize I was not worth the risk. But he did not pull away. He pulled me closer, holding me while I cried, whispering things I did not understand but felt in my bones. And for the first time since my husband died, I let myself hope that I could be loved for who I was, not for what I could give. We stayed by the lake until the stars came out, wrapped in each other's arms, talking in our broken mix of languages. Michael told me about his dreams for after the war. He wanted to go back to the farm, to work the land, to build a life that was simple and quiet. He wanted me to come with him, to leave Germany behind, to start over somewhere far from the ghosts and the rubble. I listened, my head resting on his shoulder, and I tried to imagine it. A farmhouse in Pennsylvania, wide fields under an open sky. A life where the past did not follow me, where I could be just Annalisa, not the widow, not the German, not the woman who could not have children. It seemed impossible, a dream too fragile to touch. But Michael made it sound real. He made it sound like something we could reach if we were brave enough, if we held on tight enough. When he drove me back to the city that night, the world felt different, lighter. The ruins were still there, the destruction still surrounded us, but it did not feel as suffocating. I had told him the truth, and he had stayed. He had chosen me anyway. Over the following weeks, we became bolder. We stole more time together, found more excuses to be near each other. Michael taught me to dance one night in Margaret's parlor, the two of us swaying to the music from a crackling radio, laughing when I stepped on his feet. We went back to the lake twice more, swimming in the cool water, lying on the grass, talking about everything and nothing. But the world was not content to leave us in peace. Tensions were rising in the city. The Soviets were tightening their control over the eastern sectors, and the Americans were preparing to pull back to their designated zones. Rumors spread of women being arrested, of people disappearing, of new laws and new dangers. The fragile stability we had been living in was crumbling. One afternoon, Michael came to the mess hall, his face grim. He pulled me aside, his voice low and urgent. "We need to talk, tonight. Meet me at the house." I nodded, fear curling in my stomach. Something had happened, something bad. That evening, I went to Margaret's house and found Michael already there, pacing in the kitchen. Margaret was upstairs, giving us privacy. Michael stopped when he saw me, and the look on his face made my heart sink. He told me the news in halting German, his words careful and deliberate. The Americans were being reassigned. His unit was leaving Berlin within the month, moving west to Frankfurt. He could not take me with him, not officially. There were no provisions for German civilians, no way to get me the papers I would need. I felt the floor drop out from under me. I had known this was coming, in some distant, abstract way, but I had not let myself think about it. I had been living in the moment, holding on to what we had, refusing to look ahead. Now the future was here, and it was tearing us apart. Michael crossed the room and took my hands, his grip almost painful. He told me he had a plan. It was risky, maybe impossible, but it was the only chance we had. He knew a chaplain, an older man who had been sympathetic to fraternization cases, who had quietly helped other soldiers marry German women. If we could get married, if I could become his wife, then I would have the legal status to leave with him, to go to America. I stared at him, the words not quite making sense. Married. He wanted to marry me. He said my name, his voice breaking slightly, and he asked me in English, slow and clear, "Will you marry me, Anneliese?" I could not speak. The weight of it was too much, too sudden. I had not thought that far ahead, had not let myself imagine that kind of future. But looking at him, at the desperation and hope in his eyes, I realized I did not want to lose him. I did not want to go back to being alone, to hiding in basements, to surviving without living. I nodded, tears streaming down my face. And I said yes in both languages, in German and in English, so there could be no misunderstanding. Michael let out a shaky breath and pulled me into his arms, holding me so tightly I could barely breathe. He said something into my hair, his voice thick with emotion, and I felt the tension drain out of him, replaced by something fierce and determined. We were going to fight for this. We were going to find a way. The next 2 weeks were a blur of frantic preparation. Michael arranged a meeting with the chaplain, a kind-faced man named Father O'Brien, who listened to our story without judgment and agreed to perform the ceremony. We needed witnesses, so Michael brought 2 friends from his unit, men who had seen the way we looked at each other and had kept their silence. Margarete stood with me, her hand on my shoulder, her eyes bright with tears. The ceremony took place in a small chapel that had somehow survived the bombing, its walls still standing, its windows patched with boards. It was not the wedding I had imagined as a girl. No white dress, no flowers, no family. But it was ours. Michael slipped a plain band onto my finger, a ring he had traded a week's worth of cigarettes for, and I slipped a matching one onto his. Father O'Brien pronounced us husband and wife, and Michael kissed me in front of God and witnesses, and for one perfect moment, the war disappeared. We signed the papers, official documents that made me Anneliese Brenner, wife of Michael Brenner, citizen of the United States by marriage. It felt surreal, like a spell that could be broken at any moment. But it held. The papers were real. I was real. We were real. That night, Michael took me to a small room he had secured on the American base, a place where we could finally be alone without fear. We closed the door, and the world outside ceased to exist. There was only us, only the warmth of his hands, the sound of his breath, the way he said my name like a prayer. I gave myself to him completely, without reservation, and he gave himself to me. We were tender with each other, careful and reverent, as if we understood how fragile this was, how easily it could be taken away. And when it was over, when we lay tangled together in the narrow bed, I felt something I had not felt in years. I felt whole. The marriage papers did not make the leaving easier. They gave me legal protection, a way out of Berlin, a path to America. But they did not shield me from the stares, the whispers, the hostility that followed me like a shadow. I was a German woman, married to an American soldier, and that made me a traitor to some, an opportunist to others, and a threat to almost everyone. The day we left Berlin, I said goodbye to Margaret in the small kitchen where I had learned to hope again. She held my face in her worn hands and told me to be strong, to be brave, to build a life worth living. She told me not to look back, not to let the ghosts follow me. I promised I would try, though we both knew how hard that would be. I kissed her cheek, and I walked away from the only home I had left. Michael and I traveled west with his unit, a convoy of trucks and jeeps filled with soldiers eager to leave the ruins behind. I rode in the back of a supply truck, hidden under a tarp for the first few hours, until we crossed into the American zone, where my papers made me legitimate, where I could sit in the open air and feel the sun on my face. The other soldiers treated me with cautious politeness, uncertain how to react to the fact that one of their own had married the enemy. But Michael stayed close, his hand always near mine, his presence a shield against the judgment. We stopped in Frankfurt, a city that was also in ruins but less suffocating than Berlin, less haunted. Michael was assigned temporary quarters in a building that had been converted into housing for American personnel and their families. We had a single room with a narrow bed, a small table, and a window that overlooked a courtyard. It was sparse and plain, but it was ours, and that made it beautiful. For the first few weeks, I tried to adjust to this new life. I learned more English, practicing with Michael every evening, stumbling over the words, but getting better, more confident. I met other war brides, women like me who had married American soldiers and were waiting for passage to the States. Some of them were kind, sharing advice and stories. Others kept their distance, their eyes cold with suspicion or resentment. I understood. We were all trying to survive, all trying to carve out a future from the wreckage of the past, and trust was a luxury none of us could afford. Michael was busy with his duties, long hours of processing equipment, filing reports, preparing for the eventual demobilization. But he came back to me every night, and we would lie together in that narrow bed, talking in whispers, making plans, holding on to each other like we were the only solid things in a world that kept shifting beneath our feet. One evening, as we sat at the small table sharing a meal of tinned meat and bread, Michael reached across and took my hand. He told me the news he had been holding back, the thing he had been afraid to say. His discharge papers had come through. In 3 months, we would be leaving Germany. We would be going to America. I felt my heart lurch, a strange mix of relief and terror. This was what we had been working toward, what we had risked everything for. But the reality of it was overwhelming. I would be leaving Europe, leaving everything I had ever known, crossing an ocean to a country where I did not speak the language fluently, where I had no family, no history, no roots. I would be starting over completely, with nothing but Michael, and the fragile hope that we could make this work. Michael saw the fear in my eyes, and he squeezed my hand tighter. He told me it would be all right, that his family would welcome me, that the farm was big enough for both of us, that we would have a good life. He spoke with such certainty, such conviction, that I wanted to believe him. But I could not shake the feeling that I was running from something, not towards something, that I was trying to escape the ruins instead of building on them. Still, I nodded. I told him I trusted him, and I did, with my whole heart. If anyone could guide me through this, it was Michael. The weeks passed in a blur of preparation. I collected the documents I would need for immigration, filled out forms I barely understood, had my photograph taken for a passport that listed me as Annalisa Brenner, married, German-born, American-bound. I packed the few belongings I had, a small bag that held everything I owned. A dress Margaret had given me. The drawing Michael had made of the two of us. The plain wedding band that had become the most precious thing I possessed. But as the departure date grew closer, something inside me began to unravel. I started having nightmares, vivid and relentless, dreams where I was back in Berlin, trapped in the hospital, surrounded by smoke and fire and the sound of screaming. I would wake up gasping, drenched in sweat, and Michael would hold me, whispering that I was safe, that it was over. But it did not feel over. It felt like the war was still inside me, clawing at my ribs, refusing to let go. One night, I woke from another nightmare and could not fall back asleep. Michael was beside me, his breathing slow and even, and I slipped out of bed without waking him. I stood at the window and looked out at the courtyard, at the dark shapes of the buildings, at the faint glow of the city beyond, and I felt a wave of grief so powerful it nearly brought me to my knees. I was leaving my country. I was leaving the place where my husband was buried, where my parents were buried, where every memory I had ever made had happened. I was leaving the language I thought in, the streets I had walked, the sky that had watched over me since birth. I was erasing myself, piece by piece, and replacing myself with someone new. Someone who could fit into Michael's world, someone who could forget. But I did not want to forget. I did not want to pretend that the war had not happened, that I had not suffered, that the people I had loved and lost did not matter. I wanted to carry them with me, to honor them, to let them be part of who I was. And I did not know if I could do that in America. I did not know if there was room for my ghosts in Michael's bright, hopeful future. I heard him stir behind me, and then his arms came around me, pulling me back against his chest. He asked me what was wrong, his voice rough with sleep, and I told him the truth. I told him I was afraid of leaving, afraid of starting over, afraid that I would lose myself in the process. Michael was quiet for a long time, his chin resting on the top of my head. Then he told me something I had not expected. He said he was afraid too, afraid that he would not be enough for me, that the farm would be too small, too quiet, too different from the life I had known. Afraid that I would regret choosing him, that I would wake up one day and realize I had made a mistake. I turned in his arms and looked up at him, and I saw the vulnerability in his face, the doubt that he usually kept hidden. And I realized that we were both walking into the unknown, both taking a leap of faith, both hoping that love would be enough to carry us through. I kissed him, soft and slow, and I told him that I did not regret choosing him, that I would choose him again, every day, for the rest of my life. And I meant it. The doubts did not disappear, but they became bearable. We held on to each other, and we moved forward. The day we were supposed to leave Frankfurt, there was a complication. A bureaucratic error, a missing signature on one of my documents. Something small and stupid, but enough to delay our departure. Michael was furious, pacing the small room, arguing with officials, trying to fix it. But the officials were indifferent, unmoved by his frustration. We would have to wait another week, maybe 2, while the paperwork was corrected. I tried to tell Michael it was all right, that we could wait, but he was inconsolable. He had been counting down the days, planning every detail, and this delay felt like a betrayal. He was afraid that something else would go wrong, that the window of opportunity would close, that we would be trapped in Germany forever. I understood his fear. I felt it too. But I also felt something else, something I could not quite name. A strange sense of relief, as if the universe had given me a little more time to say goodbye, to prepare, to make peace with what I was leaving behind. During those extra days, I went back to the city center, to the places I had known before the war. The streets were still filled with rubble, but people were rebuilding, clearing away the debris, laying new foundations. I walked past the hospital where I had worked, now being converted into housing. I walked past the park where my husband and I used to go on Sundays, now overgrown and wild. I walked past the church where we had been married, its roof gone, its walls crumbling, but its bell tower still standing, a defiant monument to survival. I stood in front of that church for a long time, and I spoke to my husband in my mind. I told him I was leaving, that I had found someone else, that I was going to try to be happy. I asked for his forgiveness, though I did not know if I deserved it. And I told him I would never forget him, that he would always be part of me, no matter how far I traveled. The wind picked up, scattering leaves across the broken pavement, and I felt a sense of peace settle over me. I did not hear his voice, did not receive any sign or blessing, but I felt lighter, as if some burden had been lifted. I turned and walked away from the church, and I did not look back. When I returned to the room, Michael was sitting at the table, staring at the corrected documents that had finally arrived. He looked up when I came in, and the relief on his face was profound. We were cleared to leave. Tomorrow, we would board a ship bound for New York. That night, we did not sleep. We lay together in the darkness, talking about everything and nothing, memorizing the sound of each other's voices, the feel of each other's skin. We made love slowly, tenderly, as if we were sealing a promise, as if we were binding ourselves together in a way that could not be undone. And in the quiet hours before dawn, I finally let go of the fear. I let go of the guilt, the doubt, the ghosts. I chose to believe in the future Michael was offering me. I chose to believe that love could be enough. When the sun rose, we packed our belongings and left the room that had been our sanctuary. We joined the other soldiers and war brides boarding buses to the port, a ragged convoy of people caught between worlds, between past and future, between who they had been and who they hoped to become. I sat beside Michael, my hand in his, and I watched Germany disappear behind us, the buildings growing smaller, the landscape fading into distance. And I did not cry. I did not look back. I looked forward, toward the horizon, toward the ocean, toward America, toward home. The ocean crossing took 12 days, and I spent most of them sick, leaning over the railing of the ship, my stomach churning with every swell of the waves. Michael stayed with me, holding my hair back, bringing me water, telling me stories to distract me from the nausea. The other war brides suffered too, a cluster of pale, miserable women huddled in the lower decks, clutching their papers and their hopes, trying not to think about what waited on the other side. But eventually, the sickness passed, and I was able to stand on the deck and watch the endless expanse of water stretching in all directions. It was beautiful and terrifying, the sheer vastness of it, the way it swallowed the past and offered nothing but uncertainty ahead. I thought about the women who had made this journey before me, immigrants and refugees and brides, all of them leaving everything behind, all of them gambling on a future they could not see. Michael stood beside me, his arm around my waist, and he pointed toward the horizon. Soon, he said. Soon we would see land. Soon we would be home. When the Statue of Liberty appeared in the harbor, green and impossibly tall against the gray sky, I felt something break open inside me. I had seen photographs, of course, but nothing had prepared me for the reality of it, the way it rose out of the water like a promise, like a declaration. I thought about what it represented, freedom and opportunity and new beginnings, and I wondered if I was allowed to claim those things. If a German woman, a woman from the losing side, a woman who could not even give her husband children, was allowed to believe in the promise of that statue. Michael squeezed my hand, and I looked at him, at the joy and pride in his face, and I decided that yes, I was allowed. I had earned this, with my suffering, with my courage, with my willingness to risk everything for love. I was allowed to start over. The processing at Ellis Island was long and exhausting, hours of waiting in lines, answering questions, having my papers inspected and stamped. The officials were brusque but not unkind, and when they finally cleared me for entry, when they handed me back my passport with the precious stamp that said I was legal, that I was welcome, I felt tears prick my eyes. Michael's family met us at the train station in Pennsylvania, a small crowd of people I had only seen in photographs. His mother, a sturdy woman with kind eyes and work-worn hands. His father, tall and silent, weathered by years of farm labor. His younger brother, barely 18, shy and curious. They looked at me with a mixture of wariness and welcome, unsure what to make of the German woman their son had brought home. But Michael's mother stepped forward and pulled me into a hug, and she said something in English I did not quite catch, but the warmth of it was unmistakable. She was welcoming me. She was accepting me. And I felt some of the tension drain out of my body. The farm was everything Michael had described. Rolling fields, a white farmhouse with a wraparound porch, a red barn that leaned slightly to one side but still stood strong. It was quiet in a way Berlin had never been, a deep, peaceful quiet broken only by the sound of wind in the trees and the distant lowing of cattle. It was beautiful. It was home. Michael and I were given a small room on the second floor, the same room he had grown up in, and we spent our first night in America lying together in his childhood bed, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the countryside, holding each other in the darkness. The first few months were hard. I struggled with the language, with the customs, with the feeling of being an outsider in this place where everyone knew each other, where everyone had history I was not part of. I worked alongside Michael's mother in the kitchen, learning to cook American food, learning to can vegetables, learning the rhythms of farm life. I was clumsy at first, making mistakes, burning things, forgetting steps. But she was patient with me, guiding me with gentle hands and broken German when my English failed. Michael worked the fields with his father and brother, long days of backbreaking labor that left him exhausted but satisfied. He would come home at sunset, dirt under his fingernails, sweat on his brow, and he would find me on the porch, and he would smile that tired, real smile, and I would know that we had made the right choice. But there were moments when the past caught up with me. Moments when I heard a loud noise and flinched, expecting bombs. Moments when I saw a stranger and felt a surge of fear, wondering if they could tell I was German, if they hated me for it. Moments when I woke from nightmares, tangled in sheets, gasping for air, and Michael had to hold me and remind me where I was, that I was safe, that the war was over. And there were moments when I felt the ache of my empty womb, the reminder that I could not give Michael the children his family expected, the children that would carry on the farm, the legacy. I saw the way his mother looked at me sometimes, hopeful and expectant, and I wanted to tell her the truth, to explain why there would be no grandchildren from us, but I could not find the words. One evening, 6 months after we had arrived, Michael found me sitting alone in the barn, crying. He sat beside me on the hay bale and asked me what was wrong, and I finally told him everything. I told him about the shame I carried, about the fear that I was failing him, about the worry that his family would resent me, that he would resent me, that I was not enough. Michael listened without interrupting, and when I was finished, he took my face in his hands and looked at me with such intensity that I could barely breathe. He told me that I was enough, that I had always been enough, that he did not need children to be happy, that he needed me, only me, and that nothing else mattered. He told me that his family loved me, that they saw how hard I worked, how much I cared, how I had made him happy in ways they had never seen before. He told me that if they ever made me feel less than welcome, he would set them straight, because I was his wife, his partner, his home. And then he told me something I had not known. He said that before the war, before he had enlisted, he had been engaged to a girl from town, a girl his parents had approved of, a girl who fit perfectly into the life they had planned for him. But he had broken off the engagement before he left, because he realized he did not love her, that he was only going through the motions, following a script someone else had written. He said that meeting me had changed everything, that I had shown him what love actually was, not obligation or expectation or duty, but something wild and fierce and real. He said that I had saved him just as much as he had saved me, and that he would spend the rest of his life making sure I knew it. I cried harder, but this time they were tears of relief, of gratitude, of love so overwhelming it felt like it would break me apart. Michael held me, and we sat together in the barn until the sun set, until the world outside turned dark and the stars came out. That night marked a turning point. I stopped apologizing for who I was. I stopped waiting for rejection, for resentment, for the other shoe to drop. I started to believe that I deserved this life, this love, this second chance. Over the following years, I built a life on that farm. I learned to speak English fluently, though I never lost my accent. I made friends in town, other women who accepted me for who I was, who did not care where I came from. I started a small garden, growing vegetables and flowers, creating beauty from the soil. I helped Michael's mother with the cooking and the canning, and eventually she taught me her recipes, her secrets, passing on knowledge that would outlive her. Michael and I grew into our marriage, learning each other's rhythms, building a partnership that was stronger than anything I had known before. We had arguments, of course, moments of frustration and misunderstanding, but we always came back to each other, always found our way through. And slowly, the nightmares faded. The fear loosened its grip. The past became something I carried with me, not something that crushed me. 5 years after we arrived in America, Michael's parents retired and handed the farm over to us. It was ours now, to run as we saw fit, to shape into whatever we wanted it to be. We made changes, modernized some of the equipment, expanded the fields, tried new crops, and we succeeded. The farm thrived under our care, becoming more productive, more profitable, more sustainable. We never had children. That part of my story did not change, but we found other ways to build a legacy. We hired workers from town, young men who needed jobs, and we trained them, paid them fairly, treated them with respect. We opened our home to Michael's nieces and nephews, becoming the favorite aunt and uncle, the ones who told stories and gave advice and always had cookies in the jar. And we loved each other deeply and completely through every season, every challenge, every joy. One evening, 20 years after we had first met in that ruined hospital in Berlin, Michael and I sat together on the porch, watching the sun set over the fields. My hair was streaked with gray now, and his had receded at the temples, but we were still us, still Michael and Annalisa, still the soldier and the woman he had saved. He reached over and took my hand, lacing his fingers through mine, and he said my name the way he always did, like it was something precious. I looked at him, at the lines on his face, the strength in his shoulders, the love in his eyes, and I thought about the journey that had brought us here. The war, the fear, the impossible choices, the leap of faith. I thought about the woman I had been, hiding in the rubble, certain she had nothing left to live for. And I thought about the woman I had become, strong and whole and loved. I squeezed his hand and told him what I had told him 1,000 times before, what I would tell him 1,000 times more. I told him I loved him. I told him I was grateful. I told him that marrying him was the best decision I had ever made. Michael smiled, that tired, real smile I had fallen in love with all those years ago, and he pulled me close. We sat together in the fading light, 2 survivors who had found each other in the wreckage, 2 people who had chosen love over fear, hope over despair, future over past. And as the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, I felt something I had once thought impossible. I felt at peace. The war was over. The ghosts had been laid to rest. And I was home, truly home, in the arms of the man who had looked at me in my darkest moment and said, "I do not care if you are German. I care about you." That was all I had ever needed. That was everything.